watching NRATV with Bill Whittle.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Hot Mike Show. Hot Mike lost one of his plastic dinosaurs and he's inconsolable, so we expect to have him back on Monday. Today we've got a couple of really hard-hitting topics, basically the same theme. We're going to be talking about the violent left today. A little later on in the show, we're going to be talking to a surgeon who's working on somebody who was a Donald Trump supporter who had their face mashed in by peaceful, tolerant liberals in New York City. But before we get started, let's go to the latest with the whole Dana Loesch controversy with Black Lives Matters and so on. A very, very brief recap. As you know by now, certainly, Dana Loesch, a week ago or so, made a video called Freedom's Safest Place, where she basically just showed a lot of video of the left rioting, burning things down and so on, called them out and said, we're not going to take it anymore. That prompted a demand for a retraction. Grant Stinchfield weighed in and says, we're not apologizing for anything. It's the absolute truth. And then Black Lives Matter issued a fairly remarkable response to that. And also there's a so-called Women's March that's going to be happening. And all of this is constantly in the news. And what we have to show you right now is Dana Loesch's latest response to this whole thing. So let's roll that clip and then we can see if we can talk to him.
Women's March organizers Tamika Mallory, Linda Sarsour, and Carmen Perez have spent the past several weeks accusing me and the NRA of sexism, racism, homophobia, and violence. The leftist media has gleefully spread these lies, pinning headlines each more sensational than the next. Bigots, apocalyptic, hate, shame, terrorists. But here's one story I have yet to see the media cover: the violent agenda of the men behind these Women's March organizers. They include Islamic extremist Siraj Wahhaj, race riot insider Al Sharpton, and this man.
We'll tear this goddamn country up.
Yep, that's Louis Farrakhan, a religious terrorist whose highlight reel of bigoted beliefs includes, quote, Hitler was a very great man, end quote. This is the man behind the so-called peaceful, tolerant, and nonviolent Women's March organizers. The Charlie to their anarchist angels, father of the modern violent left, or Daddy Farrakhan.
Our brother, our leader, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan.
Like the KKK, Farrakhan is an anti-Semite who incites hatred against Jewish people by spreading conspiracies. Like ISIS, he has preached that homosexuality is a crime that should be punished by death. Like a racist, he's incited division with statements like, quote, the white man is our mortal enemy, end quote. Like a xenophobe, he sows religious fears with propaganda claims like, quote, God will destroy America by the hands of the Muslims, end quote. Tamika, Linda, Carmen, how dare you accuse me of racism and sexism and homophobia and whatever the hell other ism or obia you've invented to push your radical agenda, or should I say Daddy Farrakhan's radical agenda? You don't get to call me all those things when a man you look up to and call honorable and hold hands with and take selfies with represents the exact type of bigot you pretend to march against. If you want to stop hate, start with Daddy Farrakhan. If you feel you're not safe, go tell Daddy Farrakhan to tone down his divisive racial rhetoric.
We need to put the American flag down because we've cut as much hell under that as the Confederate flag.
Ladies, you have the power to end his hate-filled propaganda. Plan a march. I'll be there. Tamika, Linda, Carmen, I stand up to the violence of men like Farrakhan with the clenched fist of truth. You let a racist, anti-Semitic man use your womanhood to push his own twisted vision for America. So tell me, who's the real feminist? And to those who march with these fake feminists on behalf of women's rights, you should probably ask them if they agree with Daddy Farrakhan's belief that women should never give up their duties to cooking and cleaning and taking care of their husbands and kids for a career. As he put it, quote, your professional lives can't satisfy your soul like a good, loving man.
And that's kind of why you don't want to mess with Dana Loesch. Yeah, it's funny what happens when you get to the actual truth and the substrata of all of this. As a matter of fact, prior to my joining here, NRATV, just a few months ago, back in January with Grant and with the Hot Mic Show just about a month ago, I'd been talking about these kind of things myself. The response of the Black Lives Matter movement to Dana's video and then Grant's addition to the video was especially vile. There's a young black woman basically there saying that the entire purpose of the NRA is to provide guns to white racists so that we can assassinate black people. They talked about Black Lives Matter as basically being a peaceful organization and so on, and that basically it's a resistance against this targeting of black Americans by white police officers with essentially what they basically stated was this genocidal goal of wiping them all out, which would be a pretty damning thing to say if it were, true. But unfortunately, it's not true. It's not close to true. In fact, it's so far from the truth. It's essentially anti-true. And once again, as with Dana pointing out the people behind the Women's March and so on, I did a video about a year ago in August of 2016 called Black Lives Matter Kills People. It's about 6 minutes long. I'm only going to play about a minute of it for you. And the minute I'm going to play is simply the minute of the statistics. It's just the 1 minute of this video where you get to hear the actual facts that no one is debating, not up for discussion. This is the actual foundation of truth upon which the series of Black Lives Matters lies are being built. So take a quick look at this firewall I did about a year ago. So what's the truth? Well, the truth is that police fatally shoot far more whites and Hispanics, both in total numbers and as a percentage of total homicides, than they do blacks. According to a Washington Post report, in 2015, police officers killed 662 whites and Hispanics and 258 blacks. And in the vast majority of all these cases, white, black, and Hispanic, the victims were attacking or threatening the police officer with a gun. 12% of all white and Hispanic homicide victims are killed by police officers, compared to only 4% of all black homicide victims. In 2014, there were a total of 6,095 black homicide deaths. That's over 20 times the number of blacks killed by police. Now, virtually all of these black homicide victims had been killed by other blacks. And as far as the lie of blacks being exterminated by whites, the truth is that blacks commit murder at 11 times the rate of whites alone. So if Black Lives Matter really mattered to Black Lives Matter, then they would protest what is far and away the primary killers of young black males in America, which is other young black males. But they don't. So they don't. But they don't. So they don't. That is the statistic that they cannot get past. It's the statistic that shows the entire movement is essentially a political movement for either political power or grievance or whatever. The statistic that they simply cannot get past, one statistic that is not up for discussion, these are FBI statistics and it's very clear. In 2014, 6,095 black people died of homicide in this country. That's a horrific number. It's a horrific number. People like me and the NRA and Dana Loesch are more concerned about this than Black Lives Matters are, because Black Lives Matter is trying to make this all about policemen killing these people, when, as you saw, 2014, 6,095 blacks killed in this country, of which 258 were shot by police. And let's be clear about this. That's not shot by police with hands up. That's the total number of blacks that were killed that year by police officers. And in virtually every one of these cases, the police officer was being threatened with a gun or so on. That turns out to 4%. So if I'm running a political movement called Black Lives Matter, and my entire goal is to do something about the black homicide in this country, and I decide to make this whole thing about 4% of the problem and not 96% of the problem, what would you call that? I'd call it a con game. I'd call it not a serious movement. I'd call it a political fig leaf, and I'd call it a bunch of other things, but it sure as hell is not Black Lives Mattering to the people who claim Black Lives Matter to, because if it was, they'd be dealing with the actual problem, which is black homicide. Of the 6,095 blacks that were killed in this country, virtually all of them were killed by other blacks. Later on in that video, which you can see at BillWhittle.com, by the way, there's a couple of other statistics that Black Lives Matter is going to find a little bit inconvenient. One of them is blacks murder whites at a rate of 11 to 1 in this country, 11 to 1, and blacks murder policemen at a rate of 18 to 1. Did you get that, folks? There is, for every black person killed by a police officer, there are 18 police officers killed by blacks, and we had one of them just this weekend. This woman was sitting in her car, happened to be a black woman, of course, but that doesn't matter to them. She was assassinated in her car doing her job. A year ago in Dallas, 5 policemen assassinated for being policemen, and it's being promoted by this movement, and the leaders of this movement are being invited to the Obama White House so they can get their picture taken with the president. And the former attorney general is saying, keep up the good work and don't let the fact that people are answering back to these lies slow you down. So there you go, Black Lives Matter. If you really were serious about this, you'd be serious about dealing with the problem, which is black on black homicide. You want to call me a racist for saying this? That's your business. As far as I'm concerned, statistics and truth are truth. I go where the truth is. If it turned out you were right, and the majority or half or a third of the black homicides in this country were in fact caused by police officers, I know you find this impossible to believe, but if that were true, I would not only be on your side, I'd be campaigning on your side. You see, I know you don't believe it. It doesn't matter to me whether you believe it or not. If it were true, you'd have a point. If it were true, you'd have sympathy from me and action from me and from the NRA, but it's not true. I know it. We know it. You know it. Everybody knows it. So stop playing these games, because we can add. Okay, we can do addition and we can do division and we can come up with percentages. 6,095 people in 2014, of which 258 were killed by police under all circumstances, is 4%. Not 40%, 4%. So that's my response to you and your entire movement. And as far as calling Dana Loesch a racist, Grant Stinchfield a racist, me a racist, Coley and Noir no doubt is a racist too. Now, all of us, if you've only got one weapon in your arsenal, and it's this nuclear weapon that you've been using for 40 years now, it might be something you want to think very carefully about, because that's a weapon that the more you use, the less effective it becomes. I don't care what you have to say about me or think about me whatsoever. I don't care about my motives. I don't care. Here's the thing that I care about. I care about these numbers. That's what I care about. And those numbers are shameful and disgraceful. And of the 6,095 blacks that are killed in this country, virtually all of them are killed in places like Newark, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, which have been run by Democrats for 40 years, 50 years, 70 years, 120 years in the case of Atlanta, without a single Republican mayor, without a single Republican city council. And that's why Black Lives Matter is talking about the police, because if Black Lives Matter really was serious, they'd talk about the fact that it's the Democratic policies in those cities that is killing black Americans in these record numbers. And I can't stand it. I think it's disgusting. We think it's disgusting at the NRA. We're trying to address the problem, and you want to go ahead and call us racist? Well, you go right ahead. Because if you did care about your people, and by the way, I don't look at black people as your people. I consider them to be Americans. There are people that are getting murdered out there because people like you are so determined to throw the spotlight away from the truth and put it onto something that advances your political agenda, and that of George Soros and that of Loesch Farrakhan and all the rest of you murderers out there who basically get into this rhetorical nicety to try and evade the actual issue, which, as we're pretty clear on, is pretty clear. So much for that issue. Now, as far as the violent left and their continuing onslaught against civilization and law, order, and all the rest of it. And by the way, one last thing, Black Lives Matter. When we talk about law and order, and we talk about wanting law and order, we're not talking about we need law and order in Coral Gables, and we're not saying we need law and order in Santa Monica or Brentwood. We don't need law and order in Plano, Texas. Law and order applies to neighborhoods where blacks and Hispanics are being murdered because of the lack of law and order. When Rudy Giuliani took over as mayor of New York City, he brought law and order to New York City. I bet you Rudy Giuliani has probably saved more black lives than anybody you could put together in an entire auditorium, because Rudy Giuliani brought law and order to neighborhoods that were predominantly black, where people were being murdered. He did something about it because he wasn't afraid to look at what the actual problem was. So, you want a little outrage? There's your outrage. Now, moving on. On July 7th, just a couple days ago, a young man named Jody Val went to a Milo Yiannopoulos event in New York City, and when he was finished, he went to an after party because he was a supporter of Donald Trump, which apparently is no longer legal in this country. Jovi Val went to this Milo Yiannopoulos event, went to the after party. He was wearing his "Make America Great Again" hat. It fell off or was knocked off, went to the floor, and it got stomped on by a woman named Emma Rodriguez. Emma Rodriguez stomped on the hat, and when Jovi Val tried to pick up the hat, Emma Rodriguez started to beat him, and so did her boyfriend Leo Heinert, beat him with a beer bottle, and basically knocked his face in. He was down on the ground, and they kept beating him, and they kept hitting him with objects, and they basically bloodied his entire face. So, Heinert got fired for it. There are felony charges being pursued against him. And here's the thing. Think about this. So here's this guy who decided to wear a "Make America Great" hat in New York City, for which he got his face smashed in. But he didn't have any health insurance, so he started a GoFundMe page. This kind of thing is done all the time for everyone or anything. If you want to go and visit the pyramids, you can start a GoFundMe page and see if you can raise money to do it. So they started a GoFundMe page for Jovi Val's facial reconstruction work that he's going to need, thanks to our friends, the progressive liberals. And guess what? They raised about $1,000, and then GoFundMe shut the page down. They just took it down. I wonder why. And then they decided, well, okay, if they're going to do that, then at least we'll start a PayPal account so we can make some kind of donations to get this guy a little medical help. And as soon as they started that, PayPal blocked any opportunity to donate to Jovi Val and the rest. That's where we sit until suddenly we enter into the picture a plastic surgeon by the name of Dr. Joseph Pober. He's a double board certified Harvard graduate. He's chief of plastic surgery at Hackensack University Medical Center. Dr. Pober and his office decided that they were going to treat Jovi Val for free because of the outrage involved in all of this, and we're very happy and delighted to have him with us today. Dr. Pober, good to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your kind offer there on behalf of Jovi.
My pleasure.
Let me start by asking you a few specific questions. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of his injuries? What actually did he suffer in terms of his facial damage?
He suffered what you can call what looked like a complex nasal fracture. He had his CT scan showing bilateral nasal bones being moved, and an examination of him internally, he had lacerations inside his nose as well. So there was some internal injury as well as what you could see on the outside. His laceration on the outside transected the vessel that goes to his upper lip. It transected a vessel that goes across his cheek to his nose. So he had extensive bleeding. In addition to that, you have a couple of facial nerves there. Fortunately, they arborize or form like a tree branch that has multiple components, so he hasn't suffered tremendous loss of motion, but he has a little bit of what might be a contusion to his nerve, or maybe a little more. He's got the zygomatic and buccal branches involved. So it's a substantial injury, and it's something that occurred as a vicious assault and what seems to be a hate injury, something I can't imagine happening in America, and yet we're beginning to see that.
We are indeed, and we're beginning to see it one way only. We're not seeing Obama supporters being beaten up. We're not seeing any of these people beaten up, but we are seeing people being bashed on the head with bicycle locks at Berkeley and so on by this violent, hate-filled left. Let me ask you this, Dr. Pober. When you examined Jovi's face, did this strike you as it was essentially one impact, or did you see evidence of repeated blows, meaning that somebody knocked him, cut a major vein in his face, he's bleeding profusely? Was there any indication that he continued to be hit after that?
Absolutely. I mean, his nasal injury seemed to be a totally separate component. His nose was moved to the side, then he had this big gash on his cheek in the other direction. So it clearly was multiple blows, and before or after he was bleeding, but there were multiple injuries to his face. Much of it was blunt, but a lot of it was sharp from fractured glass or pieces of broken glass I found inside his mouth as well. So it was a little disturbing when I noticed his injury.
Yep. broken glass inside his mouth. This is what happens when you wear a red hat in New York City. That's what happens with the violent left. That's what happens with the people. They're constantly preaching tolerance and telling us how wonderful they are and how violent and racist the right is and so on. One more question before we get to some of the sort of the interesting questions behind the injuries. Dr. Prober, we talked about his facial injuries. Had he sustained other injuries as well over the course of the rest of his body?
You know, what you have to realize is, facial injury goes far beyond what you can see, and it goes far beyond deep to your bone. It has emotional impact. It has psychological impact. He will not be able to have his injuries fully even treated until 6 months from now for the scar to have that revised. We have to wait for some healing to occur before we can do the cosmetic or reconstructive procedures you need to align the scars in such a way that won't be visible. Then with his nose, we wait for at least 3 to 6 months before we can actually repair the nose fully. We'll naturally reduce the fracture, and that hasn't taken place yet. We'll probably be doing that tomorrow. And these kind of injuries have create a hardship in your life. You have to learn how to restore your whole way of thinking. You have to rebuild your self-esteem and confidence. And what I try to do when I do these procedures to help people, I try to give them more of an advantage. And sometimes I'll actually improve the contour of the nose to give it a better appearance. And from doing that, a person restores some of the self-esteem he may have lost from the scar or gash across his face, because the scar is never completely removed. We can improve the appearance substantially, but that stigma and that trauma will stay with you for a very, very long time. And it's hard for me to see how you can heal that totally. I'd like to look at myself as a healer, but I can't take care of all the various components that play into this. It's much more than just a physical injury. It becomes, an emotional and psychological impact.
Dr. Prober, you talk about that on your website about healing patients from the inside out. And if you can stay with us for just a couple of moments, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back. And there's a couple questions I'd like to ask you about why you went ahead and did this remarkably generous act. I'm Bill Whittle. This is the Hot Mic Show on NRATV. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes.